I mean, the channel is called Mainly Movies. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be doing something a little different from normal. With a channel name like Mainly Movies, I obviously spend most of my time creating movie-related videos, but every now and then things skew towards music a bit. As you guys know, I'm pretty big into stats and keeping track of things. For movies, I use a few different sites for this, but my favorite and the most robust is Letterboxd. I've talked about Letterboxd on here quite a few times, and I also do my annual year in review video that always seems to be relatively popular. 2 years ago, I decided to expand my year in review coverage to music as well, and I'm continuing that again this year. Because believe it or not, movies aren't the only thing I like, and they also aren't the only thing I obsessively keep track of. I talk about it in a lot of my reviews, so it might not come as much of a surprise, but my other big interest is music, and I just so happen to use a site that makes it easy for me to give you guys a look at my year in music. Last FM. So I know a lot of people are familiar with Letterboxd on the movie side of things, or use Spotify Wrapped for music, but I'm thinking fewer people know what Last FM is. At least anymore. It used to be much more popular back in the day. So, Last.fm is a website that allows you to keep track of the music you listen to. But rather than having to go in and manually log things like you do on Letterboxd, you set up your account so that whatever you listen to automatically gets logged on your account, or scrobbled as the lingo goes. Back in the day, this was mostly through plugins you had to download, so that music you listened to on iTunes or on your iPod would scrobble. But they make it easy now, and streaming services like Spotify have built-in scrobbling, which makes it really convenient. Like I said, Last.fm used to be a lot more popular back in the day, and had a whole slew of social components to it. Forums, groups, etc. But it's definitely cut back on the social aspect since then. There are still shout boxes where you can comment on people's profiles, as well as artist, album, and song pages, but the big draw here is the stats and just the general record keeping. I joined Last.fm when I was 15 years old, so I've been scrobbling for like 55% of my life, which is kind of crazy, but it's also really cool to have over 19 years of my music listening data and stats to look at. But for this video, we're just going to focus on my 2024 stats and musical year in review. Alright, so let's dive into these stats. Last.fm updated their annual stats page 2 years ago, so it looks a little nicer than it used to, and also includes a few new stats. At the top, the last.year page gives an overview of your scrobbles throughout the year. It shows that I listened to 16,020 songs this year, which is apparently a 35% increase over last year's Scrabbles. I'm not quite sure why it says peak, because I listened to more songs than that in both 2006 and 2010. But as we learned the last few years, some of the stats on this annual review page don't always seem to be the most accurate. Regardless, that was just over 1,300 scrabbles per month on average. But this histogram gives a nice temporal glance at my scrabbling throughout the year, even comparing it with my 2023 data. I always do a lot of driving in April, October, November, and December, which accounts for the spikes since I listen to music while I drive. I'm not sure I have an explanation for July this year, though. The next section is called Top Music and gives an overview of my top artists, albums, and tracks. Starting off with artists, you can see that I listened to 3,066 different artists this year, which is a big 83% spike over last year. But just like last year, my number one artist was Green Day with 693 Scrabbles. Green Day have been a favorite of mine for decades, so it's unsurprising seeing them in the number one spot, especially since I did some concert prep ahead of seeing them again this past summer. Following them, we've got Rancid, a longtime punk rock and ska favorite of mine, in second place with 400. These guys were actually an opener for Green Day at that concert I just mentioned, so they also benefited from a concert prep boost. You're probably noticing a trend here because we've got yet another punk band, The Clash, coming in third with 367 scrabbles. Op Ivy isn't too far behind with 350 scrabbles, and if you've watched any of my music related videos or record store day hauls over the years, you know just how much I love this ska punk band. And the punk love continues with the Ramones filling the fifth spot. It's always so interesting for me to look at these overall stats, because all five of these are bands that I loved as a teenager and have continued to love. So it's kind of funny to me just how little my musical tastes have changed over the decades. My top new artist, that is, artist I had never previously scrabbled before 2024, was the Barracudas, the power pop surf punk band that's actually been on my listen list for years. It looks like 47% of the bands I listened to were new to me this year, which was a 28% increase over last year's already big increase. Switching our focus to albums, it looks like I scrabbled music from 4,884 different albums this year, which is a whopping 89% over last year. Just like the last 2 years, my top album of the year, by quite a large margin, was the 1991 eponymous compilation by Operation Ivy. This is really their only widely accessible album and includes everything from their only official album as well as several EPs, so it's always been my go to for them. It's got 27 songs on it, which is why it's always so far ahead of everything else. In second place, with 134 Scrabbles, is The Descendants' 1982 debut, Milo Goes to College, which is easily my favorite album by the band and actually up there as one of my favorite punk albums overall. Green Day takes the third spot this year with 1994's Dookie. Even though it's not my favorite Green Day album, I still absolutely adore it, and it got a lot of playtime from me this year, not only as part of my concert prep, but also because it was unbelievably, somehow, already the 30th anniversary last year. The punk supremacy continues with a familiar smashed bass with The Clash's 1979 London Calling. This is one of my favorite albums of all time, and I'm not sure if there's ever been a year that this hasn't made my top 5. Rounding things out just behind is Django Django's 2012 eponymous debut. This marks the only non punk band to make any of my top 5s this year. However, if you've watched these videos from past years, you'll recognize the band since it's made more than a few appearances. My top new album, again, new to me, but also new to the world in this particular case, was Sum 41's 2024 double album, Heaven x Hell. I saw them back in May on their farewell tour, so I did a few discography runs, including this new album as part of my concert prep. It's not my favorite Sum 41 album, but it's also not their worst, so it was an okay enough way to end their career. And to go along with all of the new artists this year, 60% of the albums I listened to this year were new to me. Shifting gears to individual tracks, I listened to 10,108 different songs this year, a 65% increase over 2023. Since I listen to full albums most of the time, it's unsurprising that my top 5 doesn't have all that much diversity, being dominated by 2 artists and 2 albums, with very little Scrabble difference between them all. My top track of the year, with 20 Scrabbles, was Artificial Life by Operation Ivy, off of my number 1 album of the year, Operation Ivy. The Descendants come in strong in a 3-way second place tie with Hope, which is my favorite song of theirs, off of my number 2 album of the year, Milo Goes to College. The rest of that 3-way tie, and the final song on the list, are all additional Op Ivy songs. The mostly instrumental Bank Shot, and then Sound System and Yellin' in My Ear. The Crash Bandicoot theme song was apparently my top new track of the year with 10 Scrabbles, though I will say that that's a song I listened to an awful lot as a kid while playing Crash Bandicoot. It looks like 52% of the songs I listened to this past year were new to me, which is more than a 50% increase over last year. Last FM introduced these little did you know factoids to the stats page last year, but once again, I have to say I did already know this particular one. The Zombies' Care of Cell 44 was the first song I scrabbled this past year, just as it's been every year for over a decade now. Why? Odyssey and Oracle is always the first album I listen to every January 1st. Moving down the stats page, we hit the daily Scrabble section, which is apparently only available to Pro subscribers. This is a heat map for the number of Scrabbles per day, with the brighter blue squares representing days with more Scrabbles and the darker squares having fewer Scrabbles. The white shaded day represents the peak Scrabble day for the year, which was September 20th, a long driving day with 369 Scrabbles. Just like I watch at least one movie every day, I listen to at least one album every day. So even my absolute lowest days have around 8 or 9 Scrabbles. The weekly Scrabbles section gives us a histogram comparison of daily Scrabbles between 2024 and 2023. Just like last year, there isn't a ton of variation from day to day, though my weekend and weekday listening seems a bit inverted from the previous year for some reason. I'm not really sure I have an explanation for that. Saturdays were my busiest music listening days this year, accounting for 16% of my overall Scrabbles. The next section is the listening clock. Apparently, my most active listening hour this past year was the 1 to 2 p.m. hour, which is a tiny bit later than in 2023. But you can see it's pretty consistently high throughout the afternoon and night, really only dropping off after midnight. Next up is the top tag section. This graph shows the genres that I listen to throughout the year. Admittedly, it might look a little confusing at first glance, but it actually offers some really interesting insight into my listening trends throughout the year. Basically, the x-axis is time going from January to December, and the y-axis is the number of Scrabbles for each genre. Unsurprisingly, punk rock, and rock remain consistently high throughout the year, since the vast majority of music I regularly listen to fall into one or all of those categories. But you can see some genre variation throughout the year. For instance, there's a bit of an indie and indie rock spike in April, thanks in large part to the Fratellis. Other genres come and go as well when I listen through certain bands' discographies, so this is always a visually interesting graph for me. Next up is the artist map, which is a new addition to the stats page this year. This will look familiar to anybody who's a pro or patron member on Letterboxd, but basically this is a heat map of all of the countries representing the country of origin of the various artists I listened to this year. Clicking on a specific country gives me my most scrabbled artist from that country. The US is obviously gonna be Green Day, since they were my top band overall, but we can explore a bit. The map's really tiny on this page, so it's hard to be precise, but we've got Sum 41 for Canada, Frenzal Rom for Australia, The Clash for the UK, Mago de Oz for Spain, Eiffel 65 for Italy. It's too bad they don't give numbers for each of these when you click on them, but like I said, this is a new addition to the stats page, so maybe they'll expand on it next year. Up next, we've got the music by decade section, which unsurprisingly breaks down the music I listen to by decade. We've got an interactive histogram here, and it looks like my top decade was the 2000s, with Coral Fang once again being my top album from that decade. In fact, the vast majority of the results here are identical to last year. Like I said, I'm pretty consistent with my favorites. For some strange reason, it didn't give me results for anything pre-1960 last year, even though I had definitely listened to albums from that time. This year, however, we have Space Escapade by Les Baxter, which is a 1958 instrumental album. Moving on though, we've got the repeats from last year. For the 60s, unsurprisingly, Odyssey and Oracle by the Zombies was my number one. Makes sense. It is my favorite album of all time, after all. Top 70s album is another non-shocker. The Clash's London Calling, just squeaking in at the end of the decade. Just like last year, the 80s is actually a mistake, because Operation Ivy is a compilation that was released in 1991, so I don't know why that's still messed up. But based on my overall top 5 albums, I can tell you that my actual top 80s album was Milo Goes to College by the Descendants. So, 90s should be Op Ivy, but instead is once again Green Day's 1994 classic, Dookie. We already did 2000s, so jumping to the 2010s, we've got some variation from last year that's still unsurprising to me, with Django Django's 2012 eponymous debut. And my top of the current decade was Green Day's newest album, Saviors, which came out this past year. Next, we've got the music ratio section, which visually displays some of the artist, album, and track information that was already covered above. I'm not sure why they have this duplicate information here, but I guess it gives us an overview in one spot. And as you can see, I had increases over last year in all three categories. Next up is another new addition to the stats page, the listening fingerprint. This is an interesting graphic that visually displays 5 different elements of my listening habits and also compares them to the global average. So we'll start with consistency. Probably unsurprisingly, I have 100% consistency, which describes how regular my music habits are. Considering the fact that I listen to music every day, my number here is obviously at the max, and nearly double that of the global average. Discovery rate indicates how much new music I listened to this year, specifically new artists. I had a 47% discography rate, which is just about the same as the global average. Variance looks at the diversity of my listening, specifically as it relates to genre tags. Given how punk dominated my top 5 were this year, it's not surprising that I had fairly low variance at only 26%. I am, however, surprised by the fact that this is actually a tiny bit more than the global average. Next is concentration, which measures the amount of time I spent listening to my favorite artists. I'm not sure exactly how they classify favorite artists. If it's a percentage of the top 5 for the year, if it's based on my top 10, top 25, 50 overall, I really don't know, but I had relatively low concentration at only 22%, meaning I spent less time with my favorite artists compared to, I guess, non favorite artists. This is a decent percentage lower than the global average, which looks to be approaching close to 50%, though this graphic doesn't give me a specific number when I click or hover. Then we've got replay rate, which is a fairly self explanatory category. It seems that I only have a 37% replay rate, which is quite a bit lower than the overall global average, which looks to be somewhere close to the 75% range. For me, based on the stats we've already covered, this makes sense since I listened to a lot of different tracks and artists this year. Next up is the mainstream score. Again, I'm not exactly sure how they calculate the mainstream score for individual artists, but it looks like I'm exactly where I was last year, with a balanced 60% mainstream score. My reported most obscure artist is Santa's Doo-Wop Helpers. I scrabble one song by them every year. All I Want for Christmas Is You, which is on an equally obscure Christmas album that we listened to while decorating the tree. I don't know why Last.fm stopped reporting the most mainstream artist a few years back, but to be perfectly honest, I can't even venture a guess as to who my most mainstream artist was this past year. Moving along, we've got the quick facts section. So in 2024, I listened to 31 days and 11 hours worth of music, which is a 24% increase over the previous year. That seems like a lot to me, but it's even crazier when you take into consideration the fact that I also spent 70.6 days watching movies last year. Combined, that accounts for 28% of my time last year. It's no wonder I don't sleep much. I averaged 44 scrabbles per day, which was an 11 scrabble increase from 2023. As always, I listen to an album every day, so my longest streak in this leap year was obviously 366 days. You'll notice that it reports only 213 days in 2023, but if you watch my video from last year, you'll see that it was a weird reporting error that apparently persisted here. I really had a 365-day streak in 2023. My most active scrabbling day, like I mentioned before, was a driving day for me with 369 scrabbles, which was a bit of a spike from my peak day in 2023. I loved or hearted 40 songs this year, almost exclusively older songs. This was a feature I used to be very stingy with back in the day, but there are so many songs that I genuinely love, so when I spot them on my page, I give them a heart now. And I went to 4 concerts last year. I saw Devo play when I was in Utah for Sundance Film Festival. Then in April, I saw Judas Priest with Sabaton opening for them as part of the Invincible Shield tour. Then in May, I saw Sum 41 with the Interrupters, who I've seen before, as well as Joey Valence and Bray. And then in August, I saw Green Day at Fenway for the Saviors Tour. This was actually the fifth time I've seen them, but I hadn't seen any of their openers before, which were Rancid, the Smashing Pumpkins, and the Linda Lindas. We've got another little did you know factoid here, and this one's kinda random. Apparently, I listened to 29 tracks with the word fire in the title last year. We've got a little picture of Taco Cat's 2016 album, Lost Time, here, so I clearly must have listened to You Can't Fire Me, I Quit, but I'm not sure why it's the representative song for this factoid, because there's no way I listened to it more than once, so I can guarantee it wasn't my top song with fire in the title. Finally, we've got the community section. So this section compares my stats with the people I follow on Last.fm. As you can see, I don't follow a ton of people over here. It's mostly people I know from offline. Anyway, compared to my friends, I was the third most prolific scrobbler, just like last year, even with my significant increase in scrobbles. Then we've got the Discovery Leaderboard, which measures the percent of new to you artists you listen to. Since I only scrobbled 47% new artists, I'm fifth among friends, which is again the same as last year. And finally, we've got a pro feature here called Musical Matches. So this expands things beyond the people I follow to everybody on Last.fm. If you remember from earlier in the video, my top track of the year was Artificial Life by Operation Ivy with 20 scrobbles, and apparently there were no other people in the world who had that as their top track. I'm one of a kind. Alright, so there you have it, my 2024 Last.fm year in review. I put a link to the stats page in the description below, so be sure to check it out if you want to dive deeper into any of the sections. And, of course, don't forget to follow me while you're there, so you can keep tabs on my music listening throughout the year. So, do you have a Last.fm account? What does your 2024 year in review look like? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. YouTube has a tendency to automatically delete or hide comments with links, so you're better off just including your Last.fm handle rather than trying to link directly to your profile. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this year in review, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe if you're at it to see more videos like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.